Y ahora damos la palabra a Ramanathan.
I'm going to talk to you today about climate change, easily one of the most defining problems our civilization faces. I'm going to start with the encyclical. I'm sure each of us have our own favorite parts of the encyclical. Mine is the one dealing with the integral ecology, where it convinces us we have to think of the natural system and the social system interacting together. And by natural systems, we mean nature. Social systems is our cities and states, which are all represented here. The Church, through the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Sciences, science and religion together. In this meeting, by bringing in city mayors and governors of states, it has taken another bold step, bringing science, religion, and social institutions together. So let me start with the climate change issue. I'm going to start with the social systems. I think of the world as consisting of two worlds, one inhabited by what I call the top 1 billion, unsustainable consumption of coal, oil, and gas, and it contributes about 60% of the climate warming greenhouse gases. Contrast that with the second world living side by side, 3 billion people, about 40% of the planet, still due to poverty, still relying on 18th century technologies. For example, cooking with firewood and dung. That's a picture of a woman in the Himalayan region. I was her house guest for a week. She pays a huge price for that, close to 4 million from the smoke from such cooking with biomass. Their contribution to the greenhouse gas is marginal at best, about 5% or less. So let's talk about what happens to this fossil fuels. It's basically fossil fuel is hydrogen and carbon. The carbon combines with the oxygen in the air to form carbon dioxide. How much of this did we already put in? Starting from the pre-industrial times 1750 to now 1970, we added 1 trillion tons. That's 1,000 times billion. And it took us just 40 years from then to add the next trillion. And at our present rate of consumption, in another 25 years, we put 1 more trillion tons, so on and so forth. About half of everything we put stays there for a century or more. So there are 1 trillion tons going to be changing the climate and the ecosystem, at least for the next 1 century, if not longer, for generations unborn. So what happens to this carbon dioxide? Because it's so long-lived, it covers the entire planet like a blanket. Just like the blanket keeps you warm on a cold winter night by trapping your body heat, it doesn't give you any heat, it just traps your body heat. This blanket, trillion tons of carbon dioxide, traps the infrared heat coming from the planet, heats it up. How large is that warming, and how soon is that going to be? There are already enough greenhouse gases to heat the planet by 1.5 degrees in Celsius. We have seen about 2/3 of it, about 9/10 of a degree. The remaining 0.5 degree is in the ocean, and the ocean will cough it up the next 30 years. In that 30 years, we would have added another 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion, contributing another 0.5 to 7/10 of a degree. So we are already on target to heat the planet by 2 degrees, not 100 years from now, not 50 years from now, but 30 to 40 years from now. It's just around the corner. Okay? So how is that planet going to look like? Just let's focus on the next 3 decades. We have more intense droughts, heat waves, forest fires, we are already seeing all this. They are just going to become more intense and likely more frequent. So let's take the bottom 3 billion, California is already experiencing severe drought last 4 or 5 years. Such a drought, if it were to hit the bottom 3 billion, it will wipe them out from their livelihood because they're all depending on that particular year's water because they're subsistence farmers. I also want to point out another insidious natural system feedback is happening. Because of the warming, 40% of the sea ice has retreated during the summertime. It exposes the darker ocean. We get more sunlight into the ocean. This feedback between warming, sea ice retreat, intense solar heating, we documented it. Just last year, we showed the into the Arctic Ocean by this feedback is equivalent to adding another 300 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Okay? So if we continue merrily along this path, beyond 2050, what we are forecasting heat up by 4 degrees. By the time it reaches 4 degrees, I must say, I really can't rely on our models anymore. We are talking about huge, unknown natural feedbacks, tipping points, etc. But city mayors and governors like you want to know what's the worst possible. It's likely you even go to 6 degrees. By the time that planet is unlike anything we have seen through our instruments for the last several tens of millions of years. Okay? So the question is, how are we going to deal with it? So far, this was in the domain of scientists, natural and social scientists, but now physicians are so interested in this problem. Just 2 weeks ago, one of the most prestigious magazines, the Lancet, released this report. It basically declares climate change as the greatest threat to global health. And it documents horrendous type of health effects you would be facing. And it, of course, targets women and children and the poor to be worst affected. It basically concludes climate change as a medical emergency. So, having painted what's in store for us, let me switch gears. Fortunately, it's still not too late to solve the problem. Okay? I see this as basically bending the curve. The first curve, we have carbon dioxide. Carbon emissions curves are going like that. We got to do it there. And the second curve, our climate is warming rapidly. We have to bend that curve too. Let me start with the CO2 emissions. I think of it as under 2 categories: intergenerational equity. Since the carbon we put in stays for centuries to 1,000 years, we are impacting generations unborn for our unsustainable consumption. So we got to reduce the carbon emission by 50% by 2050. These are not my numbers, the United Nations numbers. And I guess it's also consistent with what Professor Jeff Sachs has come up with in his report, and bring down to 0 emissions by 2080. What is the cost of this? The UN has said we need to invest $1 trillion per year for the next 30 years to decarbonize the economy. We are giving $550 billion for fossil fuel subsidies. So if you subtract the and divide by the top 1 billion, it's $450 per person. As a physical scientist, I see this as a $450 problem we need to solve. The second issue is intragenerational equity. Remember the 3 billion who had little to do with this, and they're going to be the worst victims of it. And 2 degrees warming is already in the bag. That 2-degree warming is something we have not seen in the last 2-3 million years. And the only time the planet was that warm, 120,000 years ago, the sea level went up by 5 to 6 meters, about 15 to 20 feet. It took about 1,000 years to do that. So we have to provide clean energy access to the bottom 3 billion. This is what exactly was asked by the Millennium Development It's not something inconsistent with that. And the cost of that, if it is borne by the top 1 billion, that's a $250 problem. So you can ask, why should I, who belong to the top 1 billion, give $250 to this woman sitting in Kenya or Uganda or India for the ethical issue? They had very little to do with the climate change. But let's talk about the selfish issue. If they get on the fossil fuel ladder, their fossil fuel consumption in 30 years is going to swamp what we are doing now. And if neither the selfish argument nor the ethical argument appeals to you, I refer you to one another that we have a shared for others and the world. Okay, altruistic. So let's go on. So I talked about bending the carbon curve. How about bending the climate curve? Carbon dioxide is slow acting. Even if you start actions now, it's going to take 30, 40 years to bend the temperature curve. For that, we have another knob. Okay? We dial down the CO2 knob. There are 4 other pollutants. This other knob was discovered 40 years ago when I published a study showing the halocarbons, used as refrigerants, is the most potent greenhouse gas known to man. A ton of that has the same effect as 10,000 tons of CO2. Quickly, many were added. This is the current understanding of the United Nations, IPCC. The non-CO2 pollutants contribute as much as 50% to the global warming. So if you target 4 of them, ozone, halocarbons, methane, and black carbon. Black carbon is basically the soot comes out of diesel. Its lifetime is 2 weeks. If we all stop black carbon emission, their global warming effect is gone in 2 weeks from now. So by the left-hand dial of this other pollutants, we can cut down the rate of warming by 50%. So without losing track of the right hand, we're just dialing down CO2. So the issue now is, I want to conclude, what's showing that the science and technology has done its part. We know how to solve this problem. By the fact that you leaders are here, it's clear there is commitment from our social institutions. We lack public support. How do we get that? I think that's where I feel religion has a huge role to play. 4 years ago, the church organized, through the Pontifical Academy of Science, meeting on glaciers. Remarkably, this is the top glaciologists of the world and several Nobel laureates. We concluded, if we want justice and peace, we must protect the habitat that sustains us. That's a remarkable and unusual conclusion for scientists to come to. That's the revolution this church and the academy is doing. That meeting culminated last year, collaboration between our Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Professor Margaret Archer's Academy of Social Sciences. This had again several Nobel laureates, major thought leaders of the world, and several in this audience were here, including Professor Sachs and others. What we came to the conclusion, of course there were tremendous scientific other conclusions, that sustainable relationship with nature requires a fundamental change in our attitude towards nature and towards each other, and therefore requires moral leadership. That's why, as a society, we are so lucky to have Pope Francis to provide that moral leadership. Let's conclude with a remarkable statement of that encyclical. It says, he here I think is St. Francis of Assisi. He shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. 2 weeks ago, I was in a public event with the Dalai Lama. There were over 10,000. And he talked about how you need to change your inner environment to change the outer environment. So it is exactly this consortium of faith leaders of all religions in the world and leaders of our tremendous social institutions, cities and states, and science, working together to have a transformational impact. It can happen. It is happening. And we can solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ramanathan.